And specifically, I want to mention how we apply this to study protein interaction in space and time. So let's start and compare the two approaches just to see what is the difference. So on the one side, we have the discovery-driven, also called untargeted approach, and we have heard all the talks that we have heard so far use this, and it's a very good tool for global proteome, PTM mapping, identification of proteins and PTMs, and also protein-protein interaction. Then on the other side, we have the hypothesis-driven or targeted proteomics. And the difference is that this allows a more sensitive, accurate, and reproducible quantification, but of a selected set of proteins and PTMs across multiple samples. And so the principles that are used to acquire this data are called here, we have heard this data-dependent acquisition or shotgun proteomics, and on the other side for the targeted, it's selected reaction monitoring, parallel reaction monitoring, or data-independent acquisition. The three are very, very similar, so I will not talk about the differences and just in general about them. So how does this work in the mass spectrometer, the different acquisition methods? So also Alicia already explained very nicely how the DTA and shotgun works. You have a set of peptides, here the colorful dots, that enter the mass spectrometer. In this MS1 scan is the first mass spec scan. The peptide ions are measured and the intensities of the peptide ion are determined. And then the mass spectrometer selects either the best 10 or the highest 10 or 20 abundant peptides and subject them to fragmentation in the collision cell. Then you have a bunch of fragment ions per peptide that will be measured, and then fragment ion spectrum is acquired that is used for the identification of the peptide. And so this is done in many, many rounds. And basically then you have you get a large map of identifications and intensities across the sample. Very important to keep in mind is that the acquisition here is based on a precursor intensity, because this is used as a selection for fragmentation and identification. In contrast, the targeted proteomics approach works a little bit different. So here you have the same, you use the same sample for it, but what is happening is that you set already a mass filter for the first MS scan. So you select the specific peptide ion that you want to monitor. Then you fragment this peptide ion, and you apply another mass filter in the second mass spectrometer, and you select a specific fragment of this peptide. Then you monitor the intensity of the peptide of the fragment over time, so you get a so-called SRM trace. And while this is here only depicted for one of the peptide ions, you do this for many, and you also monitor multiple fragments per peptide. And so what you have here is an acquisition based on a specific precursor fragment transition. In order to do that, you have to develop an assay. So you have to know the protein of interest that you want to target and the peptide of interest. And so it's called an SRM assay that you have to develop, but it's pretty straightforward if you have information about fragmentation of them. So just to give you an idea how the data matrices look like using the different approaches, I tried to summarize this here. So for discovery, you have an emphasis on a high number of protein identifications. But because of this semi-random selection based on intensity of the peptide, the data sets often contain missing values, especially lower abundant peptides. And in contrast to that, in targeted proteomics, you have an emphasis on consistent quantification across samples. And so the data matrices cover only a few carefully selected proteins, but typically these ones without missing values. And this can be a big advantage if you have a set of proteins that you are interested in and want to monitor across a large set of samples, like patient samples, or a large set of knockout conditions. Keep in mind that you have to know the protein of interest in advance for doing that. And so now I hope I could give you a bit of a sense how the two principles work. And now I would like to tell you how we apply this to a specific biological problem. So the application that I chose here are G protein coupled receptor. And up front I want to say that all of the experiments and results I tell you is a fantastic collaboration with Braden, the postdoc from the Van Zastra lab at UCSF. And just to bring us all on the same page, I would like to start to talk about the background of G protein coupled receptor. So So upon activation of the receptor with an agonist, the receptor goes through different activity stages. And we start here with a G protein dependent signaling, then receptor endocytosis. After endocytosis, the receptor traffics to the endosome for endosomal sorting, and depending on the receptor, they either are recycled back to the plasma membrane or degraded by the lysosome. While this is a very nice simplified figure, you can imagine that in real life that doesn't look so simple. And each of these activity phases is regulated by context-dependent protein-protein interactions. And these are usually different proteins at different times and different locations. While G protein coupled receptors are obviously very important because a lot of pharmacological drugs target them, and there's a big interest in finding out what the proteins regulate these ones, it has been very challenging to do so. So first of all, one of the big challenges is that G protein coupled receptors are membrane proteins, and as you know, maybe know if you have worked with membrane proteins before, they are really difficult to purify. Then many of the interactions that happen here at the different stages are of transient nature. So that makes it also difficult to stabilize them during purification. And then the last time point here specifically, if you consider these different time points where you want to figure out what are the different interactors, you have to have a high temporal resolution for your approach. And so this is why we wanted to overcome these challenges and develop a new approach to study these protein-protein interactions. The approach that we chose is based on APEX. This is an engineered peroxidase. And originally this enzyme was developed for mapping organelle proteomes. So what it does is that if you treat cells that express APEX with H2O2, it turns a biotin phenol that is provided exogenously into biotin phenoxyl radicals. And these radicals are highly reactive. So what happens then is that they react with electron-rich amino acids that are in very close proximity and biotinolate the protein. And so it biotinates all the proteins that are within the biotin phenoxy cloud. So how can we use this enzyme now for studying G protein coupled receptors interactions? So what we did is we fused the apex to the GPCR, and then we expressed the fusion protein in the cell. We treat the cells with biotin phenol, which is necessary for the biotin phenolation reaction. Then at several time points after agonist treatment, here which was 0, 1, 30, 10, 0, 1, 3, 10, and 30, which reflect different stages of the activity of the receptor, we add H2O2 for 30 seconds to the cells. What happens is that the biotin phenol is turned into biotin phenoxy radicals. And basically around the apex enzyme, you have this gradient, Bayesian labeling gradient of roughly 20 nanometers. And then after biotinylation of the proteins in proximity, the cells are lysed. Proteins that are biotinylate are purified and analyzed by mass spectrometry. So what are the key advantages of this approach, specifically for our receptors? So we have here a fast covalent labeling and intact cells. So that means you can use very harsh lysis conditions because you don't need to keep the complexes intact anymore. They have been captured within the cell with this short snapshot. And then we can capture transient interaction for the same reason. And because of this very, very short time point of 30 seconds, we have a high temporal resolution. So now, obviously, the first question that we wanted to ask is, can we monitor known interaction of GPCRs using this approach? And so we chose a very well-characterized receptor. It's a beta-2 adrenergic receptor. For this receptor, we know interactors at specific activity stages. Arrestin interacts early on after G protein signaling before or during endocytosis. Then the receptor moves to the clathrin photopid. So clathrin interacts during endocytosis and while traffics to the endosome. And here at the endosome, the receptor interacts with the endosomal sorting complex, and BPS 35 is one part of the complex. So now, we want to monitor these proteins, and that is a very hypothesis-driven question. So we want to ask, does APEX capture arrestin, creatine, and BPS35 with distinct temporal profiles. And as you can imagine, this is a perfect question for targeted proteomics, because we know in advance the protein that we want to monitor. Also, we know that these proteins, because we want to monitor them across different time points, they will change in abundance, because at some point they are known to interact, at others not. And so targeted proteomics provides here a perfect solution to get a consistent quantification. And this is the quantification result. So here we plot the intensity over time. And what is really striking is that we can identify distinct temporal profile for each of the receptors, for each of the interactors of the receptors. So arrestin, the interaction peaks early on after 1 to 3 minutes. Creatine comes on later and stays on longer. While VPS35 peaks at 10 minutes when we know that the receptor moves to the endosome. So that's really cool. Now you can imagine, I told you about this 20 nanometer radius of biotinylation. So obviously 20 nanometers is quite a wide range, and you don't only expect that the interactors get labeled. So what we thought is, while you think that it's maybe a disadvantage, we thought this could also be an advantage. And we were wondering, can we use some spatial bystanders of our receptor that are labeled over time to gain information about the localization of the receptor at different time points. And so we chose 2 plasma membrane proteins, radixin and occludin, and 2 endosomal proteins, and monitored them also over time. And so here are the results. And I think this is really cool, because we can see here how the receptor, by monitoring these plasma membrane markers, how the receptor moves away from the plasma membrane. And on the other side, at the endosome, we see how the receptor moves closer to the endosome. And so we can monitor in the same sample, we can get information about the interactors, but also about the localization of the receptors, which is really cool. Yeah, this is the summary. So we can monitor known and transient protein interaction as well as engaged by GPCRs with a temporal and spatial resolution. Well, obviously that is not the end of the story, because now we have this tool in hand, and we thought now we want to go to another receptor that is not very well characterized, and see can we also find new interactors that are functionally involved in GPCR biology. And the receptor that we chose for this question is the delta opioid receptor. The difference between the beta-2 adrenergic receptor and the delta opioid receptor is that the beta-adrenergic receptor is recycled and goes back to the plasma membrane, while the delta opioid receptor is degraded by the lysosome. And there's a big question, what is mediating the degradation of the receptor? One key information that we have is that ubiquitination of the receptor is involved in the degradation process. So now we start with a different question if you think about discovery and targeted proteomics, because we don't know the proteins that interact with DOR. So the first question that we need to answer is a discovery-driven question. We need to know which proteins are actually interacting with DOR. And the second question is then again hypothesis-driven, as we did it with the beta-2 adrenergic receptor. We want to know when and where are these proteins interacting with DOR, because this will provide us some information about the function of these proteins. And so we came up with a slightly different workflow, and that I show you now here. So everything here is the same, the biotinylation reaction and the purification of the biotinylated proteins, and we chose the same time point. But now we do a 2-step mass spec workflow. So in the first part, we do an unbiased identification and quantification of the protein to determine our interactors. And then in the second step, we use target quantification to get these really nice temporal profiles. Now, again, we look at all the proteins that are biotinylated, and we have interactors mixed with the spatial bystander. So how do we know which one was which? And while I don't have much time to talk about this, we came up with a system of spatial references. And I'm happy to answer some questions later in the VR about this. So what we did is that we targeted the apex enzyme with localization motifs either to the plasma membrane or to the endosome, and so that we can get our background plasma membrane and endosomal protein. And then we can compare the 2 proteomes that we get from the receptors and our spatial references, and so we can we believe that if you can see here in this scheme, we believe that the direct interactors are strongly biotinylated by the receptor, but not by our spatial references, and so we can distinguish between the two. You have to believe me now that this worked. We showed this for the beta-2 adrenergic receptor, but I don't have time to show all of this. So we performed all the experiments, did the two-step mass spec workflow, and identified 17 proteins as our specific interactors for the delta opiate receptor. And in the next slide, I summarized the quantitative data from the targeted proteomics in a heat map. Just to explain you short, the yellow means that there is a strongly interacting, or that they are highly biotinylated at this time. And this gives us an information at which time points after receptor activation these proteins interact with the receptor. And what is really nice to see is when we perform clustering that we have 3 distinct clusters of our interactions. If you think back that I showed you before the different activity stages of the receptors, you can imagine that these clusters represent the different activity phases. And one of them is represented here, the first cluster by arrestin, which is also known not only to interact with the beta-2 adrenergic receptor, but also with DOR. And so this cluster 1 shows proteins that are involved in endocytosis. Now, we were specifically interested in proteins that mediated the degradation of the receptor. And so we were specifically interested in these class of proteins here in cluster 3. And to our luck, we were really happy to find 2 proteins that are involved in the ubiquitin pathway. This TOM1 is a ubiquitin binding protein, and WWP2 is ubiquitin ligase. So now we were asking, are these proteins that we find here involved in the ubiquitin pathway, and we know that ubiquitination of the receptor is important for degradation, do these proteins have an impact on the degradation of the receptor? So what we then did is a knockout of WWP2 and also TOM1, and then looking at the DOR degradation. So here you see the solid line represents the normal degradation of the receptor, while the dotted line represents the degradation of the receptor under WWP2 knockout. And we see there's a significant slowdown of degradation when we knock out WWP2. And a very similar profile we can see when we knock out TOM1, which I think is really nice. So now the hypothesis is that WWP2 ubiquitinates DOR and TOM1 function as a cargo for the ubiquitinated receptor. Hopefully I could explain you how we use the different approaches, the discovery and the targeted approach, to get a lot of information from our data. Just to summarize this, if you didn't take anything out from this talk here, then at least take this out, how we use the two principles. So while discovery proteomics provides us with identification and quantification of thousands of proteins, targeted proteomics has provides us a quantification of a smaller set of proteins with a priori knowledge. The most important thing to take also from here is that because with targeted proteomics, we select a certain set of peptides that we monitor in the sample. So we throw out all the rest, and then it's much less complex in the mass spectrometer. And this leads to a much higher sensitivity and consistency of the data. But I also wanted to take home that these two approaches are very complementary, as I showed with the example of the DOR interactors. Because we need the discovery proteomics to form our hypothesis, and then we can test this hypothesis using targeted proteomics. Last slide, acknowledgements. These are very important. I first want to say thanks to Brain from the Van Zastro lab. They are the experts on the GPCRs. We provided the expertise on the mass spec side, so we are also very complementary. Then special thanks to the whole Grogan lab, especially the mass spec crew, and then Jacqueline and Donna that set up everything here to organize the workshop, and here's the whole Grogan lab. I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, for example.
If you compare between level 3 quantification and targeted proteomics, what's your take on that? How confident will you be on the label-free quantification versus label-free quantification?
So we also do label-free quantification in targeted proteomics, but the big advantage is that you don't have missing values. So even if your protein is of low abundance, you get an intensity value, and this is a huge issue in discovery proteomics that you have. So that is a big advantage. And then I think, and the label-free quantification, and for this reason also the label-free quantification, if you do it by targeted, is more accurate than if you do discovery proteomics. However, all of this depends, of course, on the sample input. You know, you use the same sample as input, and if they are not normalized very well because of total protein amount or something, so the quantification will be similarly off. Yeah.
You ever looked at for the DOR receptor, if you do flag IPs, would you pick up WP2 and COM1?
No, we didn't see these ones, and we did a few flag IPs, and we saw a little bit of arrestin, but not so strong. So it's, there's really a big difference in what you can capture with APEX than with normal flag IPs. Yeah.
Is the kinetics limited by bioping phenol diffusion? It looks like it's perfect for surface protein trafficking. How about the inner membrane trafficking?
Like intracellular, or
Yeah.
While we haven't shown this in our study, because we only used the receptors, but this has been now used for organelle proteomics for inner mitochondria, and the labeling works very well. So I think what I want to say is that I believe that it works for any localization in the cell, but certainly this needs to be tested. Oh, one thing I know, it's in the lysosome itself, it doesn't work so well because of the pH. Yeah.
The last speaker of